How to upcycle a sweater into a beautiful Christmas stocking. Add unique trim for special details. Like this video and follow my page. The supplies you'll need are an adult sweater in a color that you want, and then coordinating or matching trim. I wanted my trim to be the same color as my sweater, so I have some pom-pom trim, some ribbon. You can do lace or cording, whatever you choose, and you can do it in rainbow colors. You make your sweater so it matches your Christmas decor. Then you also need some lightweight interfacing so that we can keep the sweater from stretching out as we sew it. And then you will need some quilting cotton for lining. First thing is draw out your stocking pattern or shape on your sweater and then cut it out. I did an extra large stocking shape because that is the style I was going for. You can find a free pattern online or just freehand it. So cut that out. If you're using a cardigan instead of a sweater, then button up all of your buttons and treat it as if it were a sweater, and be careful to not cut through buttons or buttonholes when you cut out your sweater. See, I cut it out, and you'll have to baste the opening at the bottom so that it doesn't come apart as you're sewing. Then you need to cut out interfacing. You need to cut out 2 layers because you have 2 sides of your sweater stocking. So I used a lightweight tricot interfacing that actually has a little bit of stretch in it to help preserve the stretch in my stocking, but you do not have to use that kind of interfacing. Any lightweight interfacing will work since you don't need to put the stocking on and off. It doesn't need to be stretchy unless you really want that look. Then cut out 2 layers of your quilting cotton, and I chose to use a Christmas fabric so that it would match my decor. Make sure that I put my fabric folded wrong sides together so that when I cut out my stocking that I would have 2 opposite sides instead of 2 of the same sides. You know, you want your fabric to be opposite so that you don't have the wrong side facing the right side. Then you need to fuse your interfacing onto your sweater stocking. So you can see I'm matching it all up, but there's a 1/2 inch gap at the top because I didn't want the interfacing to go all the way to the top of my stocking. I want to preserve the ribbing of the stocking. I want that to be the look at the top of my stocking. I love upcycling and not having to do a new hem, and so I'm leaving the interfacing just below so the lining can hide it and cover it up. So if you're just doing a cardigan, you fuse the interfacing onto the cardigan just like you would a regular sweater, and then baste across the bottom, and if there's pockets, baste it all closed so it can be treated like one piece of fabric. Then you're going to place your sweater stocking pieces right sides together, match up all of your edges, and you're going to sew around the edge with a small seam allowance. And then you're going to do the same to your lining. Make sure it's right sides together, and for both stockings you do a straight stitch, and then once it's sewn you need to clip the curves and notch the outer curves so that it will hang beautifully. Then turn your stocking right side out and push out all the corners and edges and curves down below. Then you're going to decide the order of your trim around the top. I wanted to not cover up the ribbing, and so I kept my ribbon and my trim just below the ribbing, and I had my ribbon cover up the braided part of the trim, but you can show that part. You can do, this is the part where you get to make your own custom
design and decide how you want your tassels and pom-poms to look. If you're doing a cardigan, just make sure that you don't sew over any buttons. So I had some of my trim going up towards the ribbing and some of it going down towards the bottom of the stocking, but I had to remove one button underneath so that I wouldn't sew through it. And you're going to sew the trim onto your sweater. Start at one side at the seam and go all the way around. I chose not to pin my trim onto the sweater just because I wanted it to, you know, it kind of has some give as you're sewing, and I didn't want to lose that because I was pinning it. So I sewed it around just right next to the ribbing, and I did a straight stitch with matching thread, and I sewed all the way around. And when I got back to the place where I started, I cut my ribbon and I folded it under to have a nice, so I could cover up that raw edge. And then for the other side of the ribbon, I put the trim underneath so that it would be sewn all together at the same time. But you can just sew the other side of the ribbon and then start a new row. This is the part where you get to do fun and crazy things, however you want your trim to look. Just make sure that when you get back to the beginning, wherever your edges are cut and there's a raw edge, you need to fold it under before you sew it so that your raw edge will be covered and hidden, and then it will not fray as you use the stocking to decorate. I'm showing you how I did another row of a ribbon where I sewed right at the top next to the tassels that were right above it, and I had the both of my ribbons are really close together, but the tassels are coming out in between. And then this is a really wide ribbon, so I do recommend sewing both sides of a wide ribbon. If you have a pretty thin ribbon, then maybe you can get away with just sewing it down the middle. And once I had one side sewed of that ribbon, then I put my pom-pom trim underneath and I sewed around the edges of that one. When I sew lace, I sew the bottom of the lace and the top of the lace if it's really wide. When I sewed a braided cord onto one of my stockings, I just sewed down the middle of it. And when I sewed tassels, I sew on one side. So it kind of depends on how you want your stocking to look. So here I'm showing you how I did the lace. I started by going around the bottom first, and then I went back and I sewed around the top of the lace. But do you see I just went around that button and I didn't sew over the button, I just went right next to it. But then I had to go back and remove that button when I added my next trim pieces. Next, you are going to fold the top edge of the lining over 1/2 inch or 3/8 of an inch, just a small amount, 1/4 of an inch. Fold it over and sew it down. You don't need to worry about finishing the raw edges because it will be inside of the stocking. You won't see that raw edge, but it's nice to have that folded edge along the top instead of a raw edge. So sew that down, just a simple one folded hem. Then, to make sure that your lining stays inside your stocking as you're using it, turn your sweater stocking right side out and lay it on top of your lining. Match up the shape so that it's, you know, as if it were one inside the other. And you're going to sew all of the seam allowances together across the toe so that the lining will stay down inside, it's stuck at the toe. Then turn your sweater stocking right side out, and it will actually pull your lining right inside it where it's supposed to be. Put your hand down inside and push out all of the curves, but make sure that the lining is not twisted inside the stocking. So I like to grab one seam allowance and follow it up the edge until I make sure it's matching up with the seam allowance at the top edge and it's not twisted. Then you're going to pin the lining to the top of the sweater stocking, and I pin it so it's covering the interfacing, but it's about 3/8 of an inch or 1/2 an inch below the top of the ribbing. So I'm just putting it there so that the lining is in there, but it's not at the top, and it's covering up the interfacing so that you don't see that, and it makes a really nice lined stocking. Then before you sew the lining in, you need to add a little loop to the top back of the stocking, and I just put it at the seam and pin it right in there, so when I sew it, it will be secure up there at the top of the stocking. When you sew the lining to the sweater stocking, I sewed about 1/4 inch from the top. You have to feel where the top of the lining is inside with your finger, and just make sure you're sewing right along that edge so you're catching the lining. I'm using a straight stitch. I'm not worried about the stocking needing to stretch up here, and a zigzag will show more than a straight stitch. So I'm going all the way around the stocking, and then when I get to the part that has the loop, I sew at the bottom of the loop where I went around the stocking, but then I go back and I sew across the very top of the stocking that's right up against the loop, 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and I do a strong stitch so that it will secure it and keep it in place. Now your stocking is done, you have finished, and you have all that fun trim on the top of your sweater stocking. I can't wait to see all of the stockings you make and all of the beautiful ideas you'll come up with. Please share them with me on social media, and thank you for watching my video.